was at my eye appointment, and I was in the waiting room, and I picked up a National Geographic and I started looking through this, and I don't remember what institution or what university put this out, but the heading was, "We found the difference between ant genders," and so this really caught my attention. And so I started reading it, and what they did to figure this out was they got a cup of water and they would drop ants in, and what they discovered was that if it was a girl ant, that it would sink, and if it was and if it floated, it was buoyant.
Oh my God!
Okay. That has nothing to do with my sermon, but I thought that was funny. But in our text today, we're going to be in John 8, and we're going to find ourselves in a very climactic and very dramatic moment in the book of John. And I remember taking John with Doug Welch my first semester here. And John isn't like any of the other Gospels, as many of you have probably know that. It's not like Matthew or Mark or Luke, and there's no birth narrative, there's no genealogy. But really, it's this building testimony of signs and symbols, and it's taking his readers, and John is taking his readers to this place. And at the end of his book, he says this, that you may believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of the living God, and that by believing you may believe and have life in His name. And I started to realize, after studying this text and learning about not only this passage, but the context of John, that I wanted to know more about these signs and these symbols, and what these signs and these symbols were pointing at. And it's at this point in our text today that John is trying to make an apologetic defense for Jesus' testimony. And that it's so crucial that we can't just jump right in. I'm not just going to tell you what he said, what Jesus said in John 8. Because we need to have a background. We need to have a backstory. And it's like what Sam was talking about. You can't jump into the Lord of the Rings, right? You can't jump in at Return of the King. Because when a new king is anointed at the third movie, it wouldn't mean anything. The battle beforehand, it wouldn't mean anything. In Levi, he was talking about Stranger Things. You can't jump into Stranger Things 2 without talking about Stranger Things 1 or seeing Stranger Things 1, because the things that Hawkins went through, the thing that Will went through, it just wouldn't be the same. So it's helpful to have a little backstory. And so that's what I'm going to do for us this morning. But the interesting thing about this text is right before it, you'll notice in your Bibles, if you turn to John 7, it says that the earliest manuscripts and many other ancient witnesses, they don't include this, and so I'm not even going to mess with that. You can read commentaries on that if you want. You can make your own opinion on if it's in there or not. But for our time today, I'm not gonna go into that. But if we hit the rewind button and we flip back a couple of scenes, you'll see that there's this massive party, this massive celebration happening in Jerusalem. And by many of the locals, it was called the Feast of Tabernacles. And if you've taken OT1 with Griff and you've filled in the blanks, right, in your freshman year, you'll know that this was called the Feast of Tabernacles. And that the Jews celebrated this specific festival for the agricultural year and God's provision, and the Israelites wandering in the desert. And they celebrated the liberation of Egypt and slavery. And there's many places that we can go throughout the Old Testament to read about this tradition, but really it was just oral tradition. It was just grandparents telling their kids, who told their kids, who told their kids, and so on. And really all they were doing was just remembering their past. And it was a time to be with family and remember their heritage. But I think the best picture that we can paint for ourselves in trying to get a better understanding of this backstory and into what we're about to be in John 8 is just to remember what we did a week ago. Wherever you were a week ago on Thanksgiving break or on Thanksgiving, where everyone came to Grandma's house or to your parents' house. And for me, I walked in, and for some reason we love to sing. I don't know if you guys do that. When everyone's together, we get around the piano and we sing. And so whether that's for you, your grandparents are singing, your mom's frantically going around the kitchen trying to get all of the food ready, and we all know what Dad's doing. He's probably on the couch sleeping, or he's talking to the relatives about sports or politics or whatever it may be. But see, this we have to multiply by maybe 400, 500. And it wasn't just your family, it was everyone from around that area. And they all gathered for this one place around this one single thing, and it was the temple. And they would come together, and they would celebrate, and they would remember. And in Joshua 6, it's recorded that there was these huge torch parades that were going on. And people were singing and dancing in the streets, and everyone was there giving thanksgiving and hope. And this was a big deal for the Jews. And of course, we know that if it's a big deal for the culture, that's a big deal to Jesus too. And Jesus doesn't like to miss these opportunities, as we've seen in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, to bring light to a world that's in darkness. You see, Jesus knew the history of this feast. He knew that it goes all the way back to Exodus and Leviticus. He knows the Old Testament. And he knows that it happens just 6 months after the Passover and unleavened bread. And we read in 1 Kings that many of the people just called it the feast. And Josephus, many of you have probably heard this name before. He was a scholar and a historian. And he said this was the greatest and holiest day. And it was an 8-day festival. And on the first day and the last day, they just rested. Kind of like what we did just a few days ago, whenever we just rested with our family during Thanksgiving. The other thing that Jesus knew was that he knew about these symbols that these people and what they were doing with their culture. And so I'm going to try to visualize for us what was happening at this feast. Okay, I'm not an artist, so please bear with me. But this is our temple, okay? And then at this temple, there was this gate, and then this is called the Court of Women. And what would happen was every morning there would be a priest who would walk down from the temple, and he would go to this pool or this reservoir, and it was called the Pool of Siloam. And then he would bring it back up to the temple, and he would pour it out on a burnt offering. And this was to signify, it was to remember the coming of the rain for their next agricultural year. And then another big symbol or tradition that was going on was there's these 4 lampstands that would be in the Court of Women. This is where the women could go and men could go. Everyone could go in here because beyond this point, this was where the altar was. And so it was at this time, at night, that they would light these lampstands. And it was said that everyone throughout the land could see these lampstands in the courtyard, and they knew exactly where they were. And I started thinking about this, and I remember driving out to my parents' house, and it was a cold, rainy Friday night, and they live maybe 15 miles north of here. And I remember looking in my rearview mirror, and I could see in the clouds, I could see a light coming up, and I knew that that was Webb City. I knew they just had a football game, and you could see from the lights that it was where that was. Or I could look out the left side of my window, and I could see the lights off in the distance, and I knew that that was Pittsburgh. And some of you may have known this, but I was at the U of A for a long time, the University of Arkansas. And one of the most memorable things for me was I was in viewing distance of the stadium, and one thing that they would do as a tradition was before the games on a Friday night, they would light up the stadium red. And so I would look out my back window and I would see the red light, and I knew exactly where I was. I knew that I was home. I knew that I was going to be home. You know, and it's up until this point that these people are remembering, and this is what they're seeing. They're seeing the lights, and they're remembering what God had done for them. They could see the light reflecting off the clouds, and they remembered the massive exodus that Moses talks about in Exodus 13, and they're probably thinking of these verses. It says that the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by a pillar of fire by night. And maybe a psalm came to mind. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Your word is a lamp for my feet, a light on my path. It symbolized the provision, deliverance of the Lord out of their darkest times. And so Jesus knew the history. And he knew what the culture, what this meant to the culture, what this festival meant to the culture. And up until this point in our story, there's this continual pursuit in trying to find out who Jesus really is and who he was and where his identity is found. And this gradual tension becomes very evident as Jesus begins to preach in this court of women. And whispers begin to fill this space as he's preaching. And in John 7:25 it says, "Isn't this the man that they're trying to kill?" See, Jesus would speak, and then there would just be whispers and whispers. But the Pharisees were there too, and Jewish leaders. And as the whispers grew, they too couldn't handle what was happening. So they tried to arrest Jesus, and this was the second time that we read that they tried to arrest him. But it says that his time had not yet come. And it's at this point that the people are divided. And so people are either starting to believe or they're trying to kill him. And his message is beginning to teach. And if all of that wasn't enough, with the tension building and becoming more and more apparent, on the last and greatest day of the festival, Jesus says in a loud voice, as the priest just came down to the pool of Siloam with his gold cup, and he came back and he's put on the burnt offering in the morning. This is what he says in a loud voice. If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, streams of living water will flow with him. You see, it's on this greatest day of the festival that the last drip of water had gone on to the burnt offering, that the party was ending, that the lights had finally faded, and that the smoke was filling the sky. All the tents were put away. Everyone was packed up and they were ready to go. And then we find ourselves today in our text of 8:12. It says, Jesus speaks again, and he says, I am the light of the world. You see, I hope that now that we have a backstory of what was happening and the scene that Jesus was in, that we can see how truly magnificent and powerful this statement was from Jesus was. And I hope in recalling the past, we can now understand how this present is so profound to us even today. That this isn't something that he would just mutter to a friend, but he shouted it to the world. And while these lamps that were burning in the courts, they would have created a visual light for physical sight, Jesus knew that it was more about the spiritual darkness of these people that surrounded him. And it was seen that these people would be so caught up in their traditions and their festivals of the singing and dancing that they were so blind to just listen to the true King. The King who was the Word of the flesh, that dwells among us, the mediator of the universe, that stood shouting at them, but he wasn't condemning them or blaming them. But he just opened up his true identity to the world of present darkness. And instead of following him, instead of doing any of that, they questioned him. And they denied him. And they even ignored him. See, Jesus knew the hearts and the minds of those who would eventually kill him. And in Matthew 13, as he's teaching at the lake on a boat, he says, though seeing they do not see, though hearing they do not hear or understand. For his people's hearts have become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they've closed their eyes. You see, Jesus is trying to tell them to turn away from their darkness, to repent, to just open up their hearts and see who he really is. And Warren Wardensby, he wrote this book, it's called He Walks With Me. He described the spiritual state of the people at that time. And he says they could see the sun in the heavens, but they did not know the Son who came down from heaven to save them. They didn't love Jesus. They didn't understand him, believe him, honor him, nor did they really know the Father. Instead of listening to Jesus and carefully believing his words, they are with him, and as consequences, they rejected him. The darkness of unbelief and ungodliness was overcoming them. And you read that and you see where we're at with this text. And I think many of us could say the same thing about our spiritual journey at one point or another. We get so caught up in our church traditions and the things that make us comfortable, and the singing and the dancing and the good times, that when the bad times come, we just put the light away. But Jesus is standing there and he's yelling at us, and he's not condemning us or blaming us, but he's just saying, listen to me. Listen to what I have to say, because he knows that our future is much better with him and with his light than without him. And how much better it would be if we continue to pursue the pillar of light that he had, instead of hanging the lamp in our hearts that we just want to hang up when times are bad. See, Jesus didn't stop with just saying that he was the light of the world. He continues with this. He says, whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but they will have the light of life. And you see, this is our future. And this is our active call as a church to bring light to the darkness. And if we hit the rewind button again and we start to read the story of light that it's revealed to us, that that through Genesis, through Exodus, through the Psalms, and even through Zechariah, and even in John himself, we see that this light is changed now from this point on. It's when we let the light shine on the darkest places in our own lives that we see the everlasting life that is revealed. It's in our past darkness that we're able to see Jesus screaming at us to recognize our present spiritual self. And it leads us to the future of a life in the light and not in the dark. That we are called to be a light to this world, no matter our traditions, no matter our past, no matter our relationships that we may have gotten in. That we are called to be more like Christ, and we are to live as children of the light. You see, we may feel the sun. We may see the benefit of the sun. We may know that it's at the center of our solar system. But our hearts and our minds are centered on the one who made the sun. The one who leaves the 99 and goes after the one who is blind and walking on his own. The one who heals the sick and cares for the marginalized. The one who is sending us out to go and share the good news to those who are walking in darkness. Just like we used to, but we have been transformed by this light of life. And this too, of course, is our testimony. We are to live in line with the Spirit, care for those who are stuck in the dark, and share the rays that have burned in our hearts. And so I only have this one point, and it's to shine the light of Christ. Shine this light of Christ in the world so that they may believe in Jesus, the Son of the living God, and that they too can have life. So there was this guy, his name was Eric Liddell, and he was a Scottish runner. And he was called one of the greatest runners in the United Kingdom. I don't know if you've heard of him before. But there was a special thing about Eric. You see, Eric was a Christian athlete, and this was in the 1920s. And he qualified for the Olympics. But the only problem was the Olympics was held on a Sunday. And being a Christian, he held to his core values. And so instead of running for a gold medal, he didn't. You see, Eric's parents, they grew up in China. They were missionaries. And so instead of Eric running this race on Sunday, he finally put away the lamp that was in his own heart, and he started to shed it on the world. And so Eric moved to China, and he started to teach students in China. He started to coach them on running and share the gospel with them. He started to preach. But the thing was, in China at the time, the Japanese were taking over. And so eventually Eric would be thrown in prison, and he would die in prison, never seeing the benefit that he had. But he has reached so many people with his story and with his light that is shown in the world. And whether we know it or not, you too are a light to someone right now. And you will go on from this place and you'll graduate. You'll move somewhere that you probably don't know. But please hear me, don't let any opportunity to shine the light of Christ into a world that is too scared or too worried or too anxious like we used to be. Don't let that scare you into sharing your light on them. And so I think Weirensby is right when he says that it wasn't Christ through all of this, through this book of John, that was on trial. I think it was us. I think it was the world. And so, like Eric, we too can shine our light. Instead of trying to do what we may think is right, that we can shine a light to a world that is darkness. That we shine the light of Christ that He has given you so that the world may believe in Christ, the Son of the living God, and that they too may have life in Him.